The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing, sharp and mean, carrying the smell of pine and old snow. It rattled the shutters of Red Hollow's storefronts and sent dust devils spinning through the main street, where mud froze in ruts and the afternoon sun did nothing to warm the air. This was frontier country, the kind of place where mercy was a luxury and kindness got you killed. Caleb Rourke felt that wind against his face as he rode into town on a horse that had seen better days. The animal's ribs showed through its winter coat, and Caleb knew he didn't look much better. 6 weeks he'd been up in those mountains, alone in a cabin that leaked and creaked and felt more like a tomb every day. He told himself he was done with people, done with towns, done with all the noise and cruelty that came with being among his own kind. But hunger had a way of changing a man's mind. He dismounted outside Harmon's general store, his boots hitting the frozen ground with a dull thud. One of those boots had a split along the side, the leather peeling away from the sole. He'd tried to fix it himself with wire and stubbornness, but it hadn't held. Now every step let in cold air and made him walk with a limp he didn't have. The store's windows glowed with lamplight, warm and inviting, though Caleb knew better than to expect warmth from what waited inside. He tied his horse to the post, pulled his coat tighter, and pushed through the door. The heat hit him first, a wave of it, thick with the smell of tobacco, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies. Then came the noise. The store was packed. Maybe 20 people crowded between shelves stacked with dry goods, tools, and bolts of cloth. Most of them turned to look when the door opened, and Caleb watched their faces change. Recognition. Then contempt. "Well, hell," someone muttered. "Look what crawled down from the mountain." Caleb ignored it. He'd learned a long time ago that responding only made things worse. He moved toward the counter where Harmon stood, a thick man with a beard that hadn't been trimmed in months and eyes that calculated profit before compassion. "Rourke," Harmon's voice carried across the store, loud enough that everyone could hear. "Figured you froze to death up there." "Not yet. Surprised you got the nerve to show your face." Caleb set his hands on the counter, steady. "I need supplies, salt, flour, coffee if you got it, ammunition." Harmon made a show of considering this, stroking his beard while the store watched. "Money's still good, I hope. Are you planning to trade in whatever you've been doing up there all alone?" A few people laughed. Caleb felt the anger rise in his chest, but pushed it down. He'd come for food, not a fight. "I got money." "Let's see it then." Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He loosened the string and poured a handful of coins onto the counter, gold coins, heavy and bright in the lamplight. The store went quiet. Harmon's eyes widened. Someone behind Caleb whistled low. The contempt in the room shifted, just slightly, into something else, something sharper. Greed. "Where'd a hermit like you get gold?" Harmon asked, his voice careful now. "Found it." "Found it." Harmon picked up one of the coins, turned it over in his thick fingers. "Just lying around up there, was it?" "Something like that." The truth was more complicated, but Caleb wasn't about to explain. 3 months ago, while digging a new root cellar, his shovel had struck something hard. A metal box, old and rusted, filled with coins and a few pieces of jewelry, probably buried by some prospector decades back, someone who'd died before he could come back for it. Caleb had taken it as a sign, maybe the only good luck he'd ever had. But luck was a dangerous thing to show in a place like Red Hollow. Harmon set the coin down. "I'll get your supplies. Might take a few minutes. I'll wait." Caleb stepped back from the counter, trying to make himself small, trying not to draw more attention. But it was too late. He could feel eyes on him, hear the whispers starting to build. In the back corner, near the bolts of fabric, a man named Dutch Kramer leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. Dutch worked for the Hale family. Everyone knew it, and the Hales didn't like mysteries. They liked control. "Hey, Rourke," Dutch's voice cut through the murmur. "Heard you killed a man once. That true?" Caleb didn't answer. "Heard you buried him up in those mountains. Heard that's why you don't come down no more." "Leave it alone, Dutch. Just making conversation." Dutch pushed off the wall, sauntering closer. He was younger than Caleb, maybe 30, with a mean smile and hands that were too quick. "Folks are curious is all. You show up with gold, looking like death, limping around in boots held together with spit. It makes people wonder. Wonder somewhere else." The Dutch stopped a few feet away. "You get mouthy, somebody's going to shut that mouth for you." You volunteering? The room tensed. Dutch's smile faded. For a moment, Caleb thought it might happen right there. Fists, maybe worse. But Harmon slapped his hand on the counter, loud. Enough. This is a place of business, not a damn saloon. Dutch, you want to start something? Do it outside. Dutch held Caleb's gaze a moment longer, then shrugged. Just talking, Harmon. No harm in talking. He walked away, but the damage was done. The whole store was watching now, waiting to see what Caleb would do. And that's when he felt it. The snap. Not a sound, but a sensation. His boot, the one he'd been favoring, finally gave up. The sole separated completely from the upper, flapping loose like a broken jaw. Caleb looked down, and the humiliation hit him harder than any punch Dutch could have thrown. Laughter erupted. Look at that. Man's got gold but can't afford decent boots. Probably stole those too. Caleb stood there, frozen, the laughter washing over him like cold water. This was what he'd come down for. This was what being among people meant. He started to turn, to leave, to go back up the mountain and never come down again. Excuse me. The voice was quiet, almost lost under the noise. But something about it cut through. Caleb turned. A woman stood a few feet away, small and thin, with dark hair pulled back in a bun that was coming loose. She wore a plain dress, patched in places, and her hands were rough with work. He recognized her vaguely. She worked for the tailor, did mending and alterations for people who could afford it. He didn't know her name. She was holding a small sewing kit. I can fix that, she said. The laughter quieted. People turned to stare at her now, instead of Caleb. He saw the confusion on their faces, the disbelief. What'd you say? Harmon asked. His boot. I can fix it. Her voice was steadier now, though her hands trembled slightly. If he'll let me. Someone snorted. Mara, what the hell are you doing? So that was her name. Mara. My job, she said simply. Your job's sewing dresses, not crawling around after mountain trash. She didn't flinch at the insult, just kept her eyes on Caleb. Do you want me to fix it or not? Caleb didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk out with whatever dignity he had left. But another part, a part that had been alone too long, that was so damn tired of fighting, wanted to say yes. Wanted to see what would happen if someone, anyone, showed him a moment of decency. You don't have to, he said. I know. It's bad. I've seen worse. She knelt down right there, in front of everyone, and set her sewing kit on the floor. The store went completely silent. Caleb could feel the weight of it, the shock and the scorn, and something else he couldn't name. Give me your foot, Mara said. Caleb hesitated, then lifted his boot. Mara took it gently, examining the split leather and the loose sole. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, threading a thick needle with cord. She worked quickly, her head bent, her shoulders tight with concentration. This is pathetic, someone muttered. Ellis, your daughter's making a damn fool of herself. Caleb glanced up and saw an older man near the stove, thin, unsteady on his feet, with the red-veined nose of a heavy drinker. That must be Mara's father. The man didn't say anything, just looked away. Mara kept working. She pulled the leather tight, stitched it with quick, sure movements, then wrapped the cord around the sole to reinforce it. It wasn't perfect, but it held. When she finished, she tied off the thread and bit it clean. There, she said, standing up. It won't last forever, but it'll get you home. Caleb stared at her. Up close, he could see the tiredness in her face, the way her jaw was set like she was bracing for a blow. But her eyes, dark and clear, didn't look away. Thank you, he said. You're welcome. How much do I owe you? Nothing. I got money. I said nothing. She picked up her sewing kit and stepped back. Just be careful walking. The stitches won't hold if you're rough with them. Before he could respond, she turned and walked toward the back of the store, disappearing into the crowd. The silence broke, replaced by a buzz of whispers and muttered insults. Desperate. Shameless. Did you see the way she looked at him? Caleb ignored them all. He tested his weight on the repaired boot. It held, just like she'd said. Harmon appeared with a burlap sack of supplies, his expression sour. That'll be $12. Caleb counted out the coins, took the sack, and walked out without another word. Outside, the wind had picked up, colder now. He loaded the supplies onto his horse and stood there for a moment, looking back at the store. Through the window, he could see Mara standing near the fabric, her arms wrapped around herself, her father yelling at her about something. She didn't respond, just stood there and took it. Caleb didn't know her, didn't owe her anything beyond gratitude. But as he climbed onto his horse and turned toward the mountains, he couldn't shake the image of her kneeling in the dirt, steady and unafraid, while the whole town laughed. Mara Ellis knew she'd made a mistake. Not fixing the boot. That had been the right thing to do. But doing it in front of everyone, making herself visible, that was the mistake. In Red Hollow, being invisible was the only way to survive. She'd learned that early. When her mother got sick, when her father started drinking, when the money ran out and the debts piled up, she'd learned to keep her head down, do her work, and never, ever draw attention. The tailor paid her just enough to keep food on the table and medicine for her mother, and that was all she needed. A quiet life. A small life. But something about the way they'd laughed at Caleb Rourke had broken through her carefully built walls. She'd seen him before, of course. Everyone in Red Hollow knew about the man who lived up in the mountains, the hermit who came down maybe twice a year for supplies and never spoke to anyone. Rumors followed him like shadows, that he'd killed someone, that he was hiding from the law, that he'd gone half mad from loneliness. Mara didn't know if any of it was true. She just knew he looked tired. And when his boot had split, when the whole store had erupted in laughter, she'd seen something in his face that she recognized. The same thing she saw in her own mirror every morning. Defeat. So she'd knelt down and fixed it, and now she was paying the price. "What the hell were you thinking?" Her father's voice was loud, slurred, as they walked home through the frozen streets. "You made us look like beggars." "I was doing my job." "Your job's at the tailor shop, not shining boots for mountain trash." "I fixed a boot, that's all." Her father grabbed her arm, spinning her around. His breath stank of whiskey. "You think people don't talk? You think they won't remember this?" "I don't care what they remember." "You should." He leaned in close, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Hale's men came by the house again today. Said we owe another $50 by end of the month, or they start taking things. You understand? $50, Mara. We don't have it." Mara pulled her arm free. "We'll find it." "How? You gonna sew $50 worth of patches? Wake up, girl. We're drowning." She wanted to scream at him. Wanted to say that they wouldn't be drowning if he hadn't drunk away every penny they'd ever saved. If he hadn't borrowed from the Hales in the first place. If he'd been half the man her mother still believed he was. But screaming wouldn't help. It never did. "I'll figure something out," she said. "You better. Because if you don't, Vivian Hale's going to come collecting, and she don't take no for an answer." They reached the house, a sagging one-room shack on the edge of town. Inside, her mother lay on a cot near the stove, bundled in blankets, her breathing shallow and wet. Mara knelt beside her, smoothing back her gray hair. "Hey, Mama, how you feeling?" Her mother's eyes opened, cloudy but warm. "Cold?" "I'll stoke the fire. I heard shouting." "It's nothing, just Papa being Papa." Her mother's hand found Mara's, thin fingers squeezing gently. "You're a good girl. Don't let this town tell you otherwise." Mara swallowed the lump in her throat. "I won't." But as she built up the fire and heated water for tea, she couldn't stop thinking about Caleb Rourke, about the way he'd looked at her when she'd finished the repair, not with pity or contempt, but with something that felt like recognition, like he'd seen her. And for the first time in years, Mara wondered what it might be like to be seen, really seen. Not as the poor seamstress, not as Ellis's daughter, not as someone to pity or ignore, just as herself. By the next morning, the whole town knew about the gold. Caleb heard it in the way people whispered when he rode past, saw it in the way Dutch Kramer and two other Hale men followed him at a distance, not hiding their interest. He'd been a fool to show that money. A damn fool. But it was too late now. He bought what he needed from a different store, quieter, less crowded, and was loading his horse when he heard the voice. "Mr. Rourke!" He turned. A woman stood a few feet away, older, maybe 50, dressed in fine clothes that didn't belong in a place like Red Hollow. Her hair was pinned up beneath a hat with a feather, and her smile was sharp as cut glass. Vivian Hale. "Mrs. Hale." I heard you had quite the adventure at Harmon's yesterday. Not much of an adventure. Gold coins, though. That's exciting. She stepped closer, her eyes appraising him like livestock. Makes a person wonder what else you've got up there in the mountains. Just a cabin? And how much gold? Enough to mind my own business. Her smile tightened. You know, Mr. Rourke, Red Hollow's a small town. We look out for each other. When someone shows up with unexpected wealth, it raises questions. People want to know where it came from, whether it's legitimate. Caleb understood the threat. It's mine. Found it fair and square. I'm sure you did, but perception matters. And right now people are talking, saying all sorts of things. She paused, letting that sink in. Of course, I could help with that. Put out the right word, make sure folks understand you're not a threat. But that kind of help, it comes with a cost. I'm not interested. You should be, because if you're not careful, someone might decide that gold's better off in their pocket than yours. And out here, the law's flexible. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Vivian Hale ran half of Red Hollow through loans, leverage, and fear. Her husband had died 5 years back, leaving her a fortune and a hunger for more. She wasn't just rich, she was dangerous. I'll take my chances, Caleb said. Vivian's smile faded. Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you. She walked away, her heels clicking on the frozen ground. Caleb watched her go, feeling the noose tighten. 3 days passed. Caleb stayed in his cabin, watching the snow fall and trying to convince himself that he could outlast whatever storm was coming. But on the 4th day, someone knocked on his door. He opened it, rifle in hand, and found Mara Ellis standing in the snow. She looked half frozen, her coat too thin, her face pale, but her eyes were steady. I need to talk to you, she said. Caleb stared at her. How'd you get up here? Walked? In this weather? That's 5 miles. I know. He stepped back, letting her inside. The cabin was sparse. A table, a chair, a cot, a stove that barely worked. But it was warm, and Mara moved toward the heat immediately, her hand shaking. What do you want? Caleb asked, not unkindly. Mara took a breath. I need help, and I think, maybe you do too. I don't need anything. You're lying. She turned to face him. The whole town's talking about you, about that gold. Vivian Hale's already got her claws out, and Dutch Kramer's been asking around about where you live. You think they're just going to let you sit up here in peace? That's my problem. And my problem's my father. He owes the Hales $50, and if he doesn't pay, they're going to take everything we have, including me. Caleb frowned. What do you mean, including you? Vivian suggested a solution, said there's men in town who'd pay good money for a wife. She'd arrange it, take a cut, and forgive the debt. Mara's voice was flat, like she was reading a list. I told her no, but my father's desperate, and desperate men do stupid things. So what do you want from me? A deal. Mara stepped closer. You marry me. Give me your name, your protection. In return, I keep your house, cook your food, and make sure you don't die up here alone. No one has to know about the gold. No one has to know anything except that we're married. Caleb stared at her. You're serious. Completely. You don't know me. I know enough. I know you didn't laugh when everyone else did. I know you said thank you. That's more than most men in this town would do. This is insane. Maybe. But it's also the only plan I've got. She met his eyes, unflinching. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for anything except a chance. You give me that, and I'll give you something too. Someone who won't rob you, won't betray you, and won't ask questions you don't want to answer. Caleb turned away, running a hand through his hair. This was madness. He'd come up here to escape people, to be alone. But he couldn't deny the logic. Mara was right. The Hales wouldn't leave him alone. And if he was honest with himself, the loneliness was eating him alive. What about your mother? He asked. She comes too. I won't leave her. And your father? He made his choices. I'm making mine. Caleb looked at her again, this small, fierce woman who'd walked 5 miles through snow to offer him a deal that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. No lies, he said finally. You want this? We do it honest. I don't own you. You don't own me. We're partners. Equals. Agreed. And if it doesn't work, if you change your mind, you walk away. No questions. Same for you. Caleb held out his hand. Mara took it. Her grip was strong, her skin cold. Then we got a deal, he said. And just like that, two invisible souls bound themselves together, not with love, but with something rarer. Understanding. What neither of them knew was that the storm they'd just stepped into was only beginning, and Red Hollow wasn't the kind of town that let people like them win, not without a fight. The wedding happened 3 days later in a courthouse that smelled like old paper and tobacco spit. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony with all the enthusiasm of a man reading a shopping list, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he mumbled through the words. Caleb wore the same clothes he'd worn to the general store. Mara wore a borrowed dress that didn't fit right, the hem dragging on the dusty floor. There were no flowers, no music, no witnesses except the judge's clerk, a nervous kid who kept staring at them like they were about to rob the place. When Morrison asked if Caleb took Mara as his lawfully wedded wife, Caleb said, "I do," and meant it in the only way that mattered. Not love, not even affection, just commitment to the deal they'd struck. Mara's voice was steadier when she said the same words back. Morrison pronounced them married, told them to sign the register, and sent them out the door in under 10 minutes. The whole thing felt less like a wedding and more like signing a contract to buy livestock. But it was legal, and that was all that mattered. Outside, the afternoon sun cut through the cold, making the snow glitter like broken glass. Mara stood on the courthouse steps, her arms wrapped around herself, looking like she wasn't sure what came next. "We should get your mother," Caleb said. "She doesn't know yet." "You didn't tell her?" "I didn't want her to try to stop me." Mara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "She'll understand, eventually." They walked to the shack on the edge of town, the same one Caleb had seen from a distance but never approached. Up close, it was worse than he'd imagined. Walls patched with scrap wood, a roof that sagged in the middle, gaps around the door that let in wind and snow. This was where Mara had been living. This was what she'd been fighting to hold on to. Inside, her mother lay on the cot, wrapped in blankets that had been mended so many times they were more stitches than fabric. She looked up when they entered, her cloudy eyes sharpening with confusion. "Mara? Who's that?" "Mama, this is Caleb Rourke. We got married today." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Mara's mother stared at her daughter, then at Caleb, then back again. "Married?" she repeated, like the word didn't make sense. "Yes, ma'am." "You don't even know him." "I know enough." Her mother tried to sit up, coughing hard. Mara moved to help her, but the older woman waved her off. "This is because of your father, isn't it? Because of the debt?" "Partly." Mama, listen to me. We're out of options. The Hales were going to take everything, including me. This way, we have a chance. Caleb has a place up in the mountains. It's safe. We can live there, and you can get better." "Mountains." Her mother shook her head. "That's no place for a sick woman." "It's better than here." Caleb cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellis, I know this is sudden, but I give you my word, I'll look after both of you. You'll have food, warmth, and privacy. That's more than most folks get." Mara's mother studied him with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to trust easily. "You promise that?" "I do." She looked at Mara again, and something passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but if you hurt my girl, I'll haunt you from the grave." Caleb almost smiled. "Fair enough." They packed what little there was to pack. Clothes, a few cooking pots, the blankets from the cot. Mara worked quickly, efficiently, her hands never still. When everything was loaded into the wagon Caleb had borrowed, Mara's father still hadn't come home. "You want to wait for him?" Caleb asked. "No." "He should know. He'll figure it out." Mara climbed onto the wagon seat, her jaw set. "Let's go before I change my mind." They were halfway out of town when Dutch Kramer stepped into the road. He wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both carrying rifles. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun tucked under his coat. "Well, well," Dutch said, grinning. "Heard you got hitched, Rourke. Congratulations." "Get out of the way. Just wanted to offer my best wishes, and maybe a little advice. Dutch walked closer, his boots crunching in the snow. See, word around town is you came into some money. Gold, specifically. And folks are curious about where a man like you gets gold. Found it. Already told Harmon. Yeah, you did. But finding gold's one thing, keeping it's another. Dutch's grin widened. Especially when you got a wife now. And a sick mother-in-law. That's a lot of mouths to feed. A lot of people depending on you. Caleb's hand tightened on the reins. Say what you came to say, Dutch. Mrs. Hale wants to make you an offer. A partnership. You tell her where you found that gold, let her people work the claim, and she'll cut you in for 20%. Clean, legal, no trouble. And if I say no? Dutch shrugged. Then I guess you're on your own. And being on your own out here? That can be dangerous. Accidents happen, cabins catch fire, people get lost in the snow. His eyes flicked to Mara. Especially people who don't belong in the mountains. Mara spoke before Caleb could. We don't want your partnership. Dutch looked at her like he'd just noticed a bug on his boot. Nobody asked you, sweetheart. I'm his wife. That means his business is my business. Wife, Dutch laughed. You think marrying this freak makes you somebody? You're still Ellis's daughter, still the same pathetic little seamstress who fixes boots for scraps. And you're still Vivian Hale's dog, Mara shot back. At least I chose my situation. The smile fell off Dutch's face. He took a step forward, hand moving toward his gun, but Caleb was faster. He stood up on the wagon seat, his own gun already drawn and pointed at Dutch's chest. Touch her and I'll put a hole in you. The two men with Dutch raised their rifles, but Dutch held up a hand, stopping them. The street had gone quiet. People were watching from windows, from doorways, waiting to see how this would play out. Dutch stared at Caleb for a long moment, then smiled again, cold and mean. You just made a big mistake, Rourke. Won't be my first. We'll see how tough you are when winter really sets in, when your supplies run out, when your wife starts regretting this little arrangement. Dutch stepped back, tipping his hat in mock courtesy. Enjoy the honeymoon. He and his men moved aside. Caleb kept his gun up until they were clear, then sat down and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, carrying them out of Red Hollow and toward the mountains. Mara didn't speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was quiet. I shouldn't have said that. About what? Calling him a dog. I made it worse. He was already planning to make it worse. You just gave him an excuse to feel justified. Caleb glanced at her. You scared? Terrified. Good. That means you're paying attention. Behind them, wrapped in blankets and half asleep, Mara's mother coughed softly. The sound was wet and painful, a reminder of how fragile everything had become. The climb up the mountain took 4 hours. The wagon struggled on the frozen path, wheels slipping in the snow, the horse straining against the weight. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for how ugly the day had been. Mara climbed down from the wagon and stared at the cabin. It wasn't much to look at. Rough logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney leaking smoke, a single window covered with oiled paper. But it was solid, and it was standing, and right now, that felt like a miracle. It's not what you're used to, Caleb said, unloading the supplies. I'm not used to much. Mara helped her mother down from the wagon, supporting her weight as they walked toward the door. Does the roof leak? Only when it rains. Does the stove work? Mostly. Then it's better than where we were. Inside the cabin was dim and cold, but Caleb got the stove going quickly. Flames caught, heat spread, and slowly the space came to life. There was one bed, the cot Caleb had been sleeping on, and a pile of furs in the corner that could serve as a second. Mara got her mother settled on the cot, tucking blankets around her, whispering reassurances that everything would be all right. Caleb watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder in his own home. This was what he'd signed up for, but the reality of it, 2 women in his space, their presence changing everything, made his chest tight. I'll sleep on the floor, he said. Mara looked up. You don't have to. I do. You and your mother take the bed. I'll be fine. Caleb, it's not up for discussion. He grabbed the pile of furs and spread them near the stove. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to make this work. Mara looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won. She nodded, pulling off her boots and lying down next to her mother. Within minutes, both women were asleep. Caleb sat by the stove, feeding it wood, watching the flames dance. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the promise of snow. He thought about Dutch Kramer, about Vivian Hale, about the threats that would keep coming until something broke. But he also thought about Mara kneeling in the dirt to fix his boot, about the way she'd stood up to Dutch without flinching, about the deal they'd made. Not out of love, but out of something maybe more important: survival. The next morning came hard and cold. Caleb woke to find Mara already up, stoking the fire and boiling water for coffee. She'd tied her hair back and rolled up her sleeves, and there was something almost fierce in the way she moved, like she was claiming the space, making it hers. "Morning," he said. "Morning, your coffee's terrible, by the way. I'm aware. I'll fix it." She poured him a cup anyway, the liquid dark and bitter. "What's the plan today?" "I need to check the traps, chop wood, reinforce the barn before the next storm. You and your mother should stay inside. Keep warm." "I can help." "You just got here." "And I'm not here to be decoration." Mara handed him the coffee. "I told you, I pull my weight. So tell me what needs doing, and I'll do it." Caleb studied her. Most women he'd known would have been complaining by now, demanding comforts he couldn't provide. But Mara wasn't most women. "All right," he said. "You can help with the wood, but if you get cold, you come inside. No heroics." "Same to you." They worked through the morning, falling into a rhythm that felt less awkward than Caleb expected. Mara was stronger than she looked, and she didn't complain when splinters bit into her hands or when the cold made her fingers stiff. By noon, they'd chopped enough wood to last a week, and Caleb found himself almost enjoying the company. Almost. That afternoon, while Mara tended to her mother, Caleb rode down to check the traps he'd set near the creek. 2 rabbits, both frozen solid. He reset the traps and was heading back when he saw the tracks. Boot prints. Fresh. Leading up toward the cabin from the south. Caleb's hand went to his rifle. He followed the tracks carefully, scanning the trees for movement. Whoever had been here was gone now, but the message was clear. They were being watched. Back at the cabin, he found Mara cutting vegetables for stew, her mother asleep on the cot. He set the rabbits on the table and checked the window, looking for any sign of movement in the trees. "What's wrong?" Mara asked. "Someone was here, close to the cabin." Her hand stilled. "Dutch?" "Probably, or someone he sent." Caleb moved to the door, checking the latch. "From now on, keep the door barred when I'm not here, and don't go outside alone." "You think they'll come back?" "I know they will." Mara set down the knife, wiping her hands on her apron. "Then we need a plan. Something better than just waiting for them to make a move." "I'm open to suggestions." She thought for a moment, chewing her lip. "What if we beat them to it? Go back to town, make it public that we're married and settled. Show them we're not hiding, we're not scared. That's exactly what they'll expect." "Maybe. But it'll also force Vivian's hand. Right now she's got time to plan, to spread rumors, to turn people against us. If we go down there and act like everything's normal, it disrupts her narrative." Caleb frowned. "Or it gives her a chance to make a move in front of witnesses. Either way, we're not just sitting here waiting to get picked off." Mara met his eyes. "I didn't marry you to hide in the mountains. I married you to survive, and survival means fighting back." Caleb wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She was right. Hiding hadn't worked for him before, and it wouldn't work now. "All right," he said. "We go to town, but we do it smart. We stay together, we don't take any bait, and at the first sign of trouble, we leave." Agreed. They made the trip 2 days later, leaving Mara's mother in the cabin with enough wood and food to last. The ride down was tense, both of them scanning the trees for ambush, but they reached Red Hollow without incident. The town looked the same as always: muddy streets, sagging buildings, people going about their business with the same mixture of exhaustion and resignation that defined frontier life. But when Caleb and Mara rode in together, people stopped and stared. Whispers started immediately. They tied the horses outside the general store and walked in together. Harmon looked up from behind the counter, his expression somewhere between surprise and disgust. "Heard you two got married," he said. "You heard right," Caleb replied. "That's something." Mara stepped forward. "We need supplies, flour, salt, sugar if you have it, and I'll need fabric, at least 10 yards. Fabric? Harmon blinked. What for? Curtains. And a proper dress. Unless you think I should keep wearing borrowed clothes. The simple domesticity of the request seemed to throw Harmon off balance. He glanced at Caleb, then back at Mara, like he was trying to figure out the angle. I'll get the supplies, he muttered, disappearing into the back. While they waited, other people drifted into the store. Not to shop, but to gawk. Caleb recognized a few faces. The blacksmith, the banker's wife, a couple of miners who worked claims north of town. None of them spoke, but their stares said plenty. Then Vivian Hale walked in. She looked immaculate as always, her dress perfectly pressed, her hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a fashionable hat. But her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. Mrs. Rourke, she said, her voice dripping with false warmth. How lovely to see you. Mara didn't flinch. Mrs. Hale. I heard about your marriage. Such a surprise. And so sudden. Vivian's eyes flicked to Caleb. I do hope you know what you're doing, dear. The mountains are no place for a woman of your delicate constitution. I'm stronger than I look. I'm sure you are. But strength isn't everything. You'll need friends, allies, people who can help when things get difficult. Vivian stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Mara and Caleb could hear. Your father's debt is still outstanding, you know, $50. I haven't forgotten. That's not my problem anymore, isn't it? Because from where I stand, you're still his daughter, and debts have a way of following people. Vivian's smile widened. Unless, of course, your new husband would like to settle it. $50 is nothing for a man with gold. Caleb felt Mara tense beside him. He put a hand on her arm, gentle but firm. The debt's between you and Ellis, he said. We're not part of it. How noble. But you might want to reconsider, because if Mr. Ellis can't pay, I'll have no choice but to take collateral. His house, what's left of it. And since his wife is currently living in your cabin, that makes things complicated. Mara's voice was ice. My mother's not collateral. Of course not. But the law's the law, and I do have a legal claim. Vivian tilted her head, studying them like insects under glass. Tell you what, I'll give you 2 weeks. If your father pays what he owes, we'll call it settled. If not, we'll discuss other arrangements. She swept out of the store, leaving silence in her wake. Harmon returned with the supplies, his hands shaking slightly as he tallied the cost. Caleb paid without argument, and they loaded everything onto the wagon. Neither of them spoke until they were out of town, the buildings fading behind them. She's going to come after my mother, Mara said finally. She's going to try. We can't let that happen. We won't. Caleb snapped the reins, urging the horse faster. But we need to be smart about this. Vivian's playing a long game. She wants us desperate, wants us to make mistakes. So what do? We don't give her what she wants. We stay calm, we stay together, and we find a way to turn this around. He looked at Mara. Your father. Any chance he'll actually pay that debt? No, he doesn't have the money, and even if he did, he'd drink it before he'd pay Vivian. Then we need leverage, something that makes Vivian back off. Like what? Caleb didn't have an answer, not yet. But as they climbed back toward the cabin, an idea started forming in his mind. Dangerous, maybe stupid, but possible. The next week crawled by in a blur of work and worry. Mara threw herself into making the cabin livable, sewing curtains, mending clothes, organizing supplies with the kind of fierce determination that left no room for doubt. Her mother improved slightly, the mountain air and consistent meals bringing color back to her cheeks. And Caleb found himself settling into a routine that felt almost normal. Almost. But every night, he checked the perimeter. Every morning, he scanned for tracks. And every time he looked at Mara, he saw the same tension he felt. The waiting, the knowing that something bad was coming and there was nothing they could do but prepare. On the 8th day, Dutch Kramer came back. This time, he brought 5 men. Caleb saw them from the ridgeline where he'd been checking traps. 6 horses, moving slow and deliberate up the mountain path. He ran back to the cabin, his breath coming hard, his mind racing. Mara looked up from the stove when he burst through the door. What? They're coming. 6 of them, Dutch and 5 others. Her face went pale. Now? 5 minutes, maybe less. Caleb grabbed his rifle, checked the load. Get your mother to the cellar. There's a trap door under the rug. Get her down there and don't come out until I say. What are you going to do? Talk to them. Try to keep this from turning into something worse. And if talking doesn't work, Caleb met her eyes. Then it gets worse. Mara moved quickly, helping her mother off the cot and guiding her toward the trap door. The older woman protested weakly, but Mara was firm, her voice low and urgent. By the time the sound of hooves echoed outside, both women were hidden. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. Dutch and his men reined in their horses 20 feet away, fanning out in a loose semicircle. They all carried guns. They all looked ready to use them. "Rourke," Dutch called out, grinning. "Didn't expect to see us so soon, did you?" "What do you want, Dutch?" "Just delivering a message from Mrs. Hale. She wanted me to remind you that the 2 weeks are almost up. Your father-in-law still hasn't paid his debt." "That's between him and her." "See, that's where you're wrong. Because Mrs. Hale's been doing some digging, and she found out something interesting. That gold you found? Turns out it might have belonged to a prospector named Jameson who went missing 20 years ago. His family's still around. They might have a legal claim." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's a lie." "Maybe, but proving it'll take time. Lawyers, courts, all that mess. And in the meantime, Mrs. Hale's filed a claim of her own, says you owe her for the use of land that might not even be yours." Dutch's grin widened. "Funny how things work out, isn't it? Get off my property." "Or what? You gonna shoot all 6 of us?" Dutch leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's how this is gonna go. You and your little wife pack up and leave. Tonight. You go back wherever you came from, and we forget this whole thing happened. You stay, and we make it real uncomfortable for you." "I'm not leaving." "Then I guess we got a problem." One of the men with Dutch raised his rifle. Caleb's finger moved to the trigger of his own gun, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment where everything either held together or fell apart. And then Mara stepped out of the cabin. She didn't have a gun, didn't have anything except her presence and a cold, hard stare that cut through the tension like a knife. "You want to threaten us, Dutch?" she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "Go ahead. But know this. If anything happens to me, to my mother, or to Caleb, there's a letter in town. At the courthouse, addressed to the territorial marshal. It lists every illegal thing Vivian Hale's done in the last 5 years. Every bribe, every threat, every shady land deal. You shoot us, that letter gets opened, and Vivian goes to prison." Dutch's grin faltered. "You're bluffing." "Am I? You want to bet your boss's freedom on it?" The silence stretched tight. Caleb could see Dutch calculating, trying to figure out if Mara was telling the truth. The thing was, Caleb didn't know either. But the conviction in her voice was absolute. Finally, Dutch spat into the snow. "This ain't over." "I know," Mara said, "but it's over for today." Dutch yanked his horse around, and his men followed. They rode back down the mountain, leaving nothing but hoof prints and the echo of hooves fading into the trees. When they were gone, Caleb lowered his rifle and turned to Mara. "Is there actually a letter?" "No." "You just made that up?" "Completely." Caleb stared at her, and then, despite everything, despite the danger and the fear, he laughed. It came out rough and startled, but it was real. "You're insane," he said. "Maybe, but it worked." Mara's hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady. "For now, anyway. They'll be back." "I know, but next time we'll be ready." She went inside to get her mother, and Caleb stood on the porch, watching the empty path. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of red and gold. Somewhere down in Red Hollow, Vivian Hale was planning her next move. Somewhere closer, Dutch Kramer was licking his wounds and sharpening his knives. But up here, on this mountain, in this fragile sanctuary they'd built from nothing but desperation and grit, Caleb Rourke felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And hope, he was learning, was the most dangerous thing of all. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay on the furs near the stove, listening to the wind shake the cabin walls and thinking about the look on Dutch's face when Mara had called his bluff. The woman had guts. He'd give her that. But guts only got you so far when you were facing people who had money, power, and no conscience. Around midnight, he heard movement. Mara, sitting up on the cot, her silhouette dark against the dying firelight. "Can't sleep either?" she whispered. No. She stood, careful not to wake her mother, and moved to the stove. Caleb sat up, watching as she added wood to the coals and coaxed them back to life. The flames caught, throwing dancing shadows across her face. "We need to actually write that letter," she said. "You think it'll make a difference?" "I think it's the only card we have." Mara sat down across from him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "Vivian's been running Red Hollow like her personal kingdom for years. Somebody must have records. Proof of what she's done. And who's going to give us that proof? Everyone in town's either working for her or scared of her." "Not everyone." Mara's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "The banker's wife, Mrs. Chen. I used to sew for her. She hated Vivian, said she was bleeding the town dry. If anyone kept track of the shady deals, it'd be her husband. And if we could get her to help us, that's a big if." "Everything's a big if right now." Mara pulled the blanket tighter. "But doing nothing guarantees we lose. At least this gives us a chance." Caleb studied her. 3 weeks ago, this woman had been invisible, overlooked, someone the whole town treated like furniture. Now she was sitting in his cabin, planning strategy like a general preparing for war. The transformation was something to see. "All right," he said, "we go back to town. We talk to Mrs. Chen, but we do it careful. No announcements, no drawing attention." "Agreed. And if this doesn't work, it has to work." Mara's voice was firm. "Because I'm not spending the rest of my life running." They left at dawn 2 days later, while the sky was still pink, and the world felt suspended between night and day. Mara's mother was stronger now, well enough to be left alone for a few hours, though she fussed and worried until Mara promised they'd be back before dark. The ride down was quiet. Both of them were thinking, planning, trying to anticipate what could go wrong. Red Hollow appeared through the trees like a scar on the landscape. Gray buildings, muddy streets, smoke rising from chimneys in thin, dispirited columns. They tied the horses behind the livery stable, out of sight from the main street, and made their way on foot toward the Chen house. It sat on the better side of town, a neat 2-story with painted shutters and a garden that would be beautiful come spring. Right now it just looked cold. Mara knocked. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the door opened a crack, and Mrs. Chen's face appeared, middle-aged, Chinese, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mara Ellis," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Or should I say, Mrs. Rourke now." "Mrs. Chen, can we come in?" The older woman's eyes flicked to Caleb, assessing him in a single glance. Then she opened the door wider. "Quickly, before someone sees." Inside, the house was warm and orderly, with furniture that spoke of taste and care. Mrs. Chen led them to a sitting room and closed the curtains before turning to face them. "You're taking a risk coming here," she said. "We know," Mara replied, "but we need help." "With what?" "Vivian Hale." Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. "That woman is poison." "We know that too. That's why we need evidence, records of what she's done, the bribes, the illegal land claims, the threats, anything that would hold up with the territorial marshal." "And you think my husband has this evidence?" "I think he's the only person in town who might." Mara leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, you know what she's doing. You've seen it. The way she bleeds people dry, ruins lives, and walks away clean. Someone has to stop her. And you think 2 outcasts from the mountain are going to be that someone? We're going to try." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the arm of her chair. Finally, she sighed. "My husband keeps records. Very detailed records. He's a careful man, and he doesn't trust Vivian any more than I do. But giving you those records puts him at risk, puts both of us at risk." "We understand," Caleb said. "And we wouldn't ask if we had another choice." "What's your plan, assuming you get this evidence?" "We take it to the territorial marshal in Carson City. Let the law handle it." "The law?" Mrs. Chen laughed, bitter. "You have more faith in it than I do." "Maybe, but it's better than doing nothing." Mrs. Chen stood pacing to the window. Outside, Red Hollow went about its business, unaware that its entire power structure might be about to shift. She turned back to them, decision made. "I'll talk to my husband. If he agrees, he'll have copies made. But it will take time, a few days at least. And you'll need to be very, very careful. If Vivian suspects anything, she'll move against all of us. We'll be careful, Mara promised. See that you are. Mrs. Chen moved to the door, opening it slightly and checking the street. Go now. Come back in 3 days after dark. And for the love of everything, don't tell anyone where you got this information. They left the way they came, slipping through back streets and alleys, avoiding the main road where Dutch's men might be watching. They were almost to the livery when Caleb heard the voice. Well, look who it is! He turned. Mara's father stood in the mouth of an alley, swaying slightly, a bottle in his hand. He looked worse than the last time Caleb had seen him. Thinner, dirtier, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. Papa, Mara said, her voice tight. Don't papa me. You ran off and left me to deal with the Hales alone. You brought that on yourself. I'm your father. You stopped being my father the day you tried to sell me to settle your debts. Ellis stumbled forward, his face twisting with rage and self-pity. You think you're better than me now? Think you're safe up in that mountain with your rich husband? I think I made a choice, something you never had the spine to do. He raised his hand like he might strike her, but Caleb stepped between them, his presence alone enough to make Ellis hesitate. Walk away, Caleb said quietly. This ain't your business. She's my wife. That makes it my business. Ellis looked at him, then at Mara, and something in his face crumpled. I needed that money. Vivian's going to take everything. The house, what's left of it. She says I got till the end of the week. Then you should have thought about that before you drank away every penny we had, Mara said, her voice hard as stone. I'm done saving you from yourself. Mara, please. No, you made your choices. Now live with them. She walked past him, heading for the horses. Caleb followed, leaving Ellis standing in the alley, the bottle hanging from his limp hand. They rode in silence for the first mile, but Caleb could see the way Mara's jaw was clenched, the tension in her shoulders. Finally, he spoke. You all right? No, but I will be. He's still your father. He's a drunk who would have sold me to the highest bidder. Her voice cracked slightly. I know I'm supposed to feel something. Sympathy, maybe, or guilt for leaving him. But all I feel is tired. That's fair. Is it? She looked at him. You ever walk away from family? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Yeah, a long time ago. Did you regret it? Every day, but I'd do it again. He met her eyes. Some people are poison, Mara. Doesn't matter if they're blood. Staying close just means they take you down with them. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson. Mara's mother was awake and anxious, firing questions the moment they walked in. Mara reassured her, glossing over the encounter with her father and focusing instead on the tentative promise Mrs. Chen had made. Over the next 3 days, they fell into a routine that felt almost domestic. Mara cooked, cleaned, and cared for her mother. Caleb hunted, chopped wood, and reinforced the cabin against the coming winter. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. About nothing, about everything, slowly learning each other's edges and corners. Caleb discovered that Mara had a sharp sense of humor, dry and unexpected. Mara learned that Caleb had been a soldier once, before the mountains, before the isolation. Neither of them pushed for more than the other was willing to give, but the space between them felt less like distance and more like respect. On the third night, they rode back to town under cover of darkness. The Chen house was dark except for a single lamp in the window, the signal they'd agreed upon. They knocked, and Mrs. Chen answered immediately, pulling them inside. My husband's in his study, she said. He has what you need. They followed her to a small room lined with ledgers and files. Mr. Chen sat behind a desk, a thin man with silver hair and hands that shook slightly as he pushed a leather folder across the polished wood. 5 years of records, he said, his accent thick but his English clear. Loan agreements with terms that violate territorial law, forced sales of property at below market value, threats documented in letters she was foolish enough to put in writing, and a few other things that will interest the marshal. Caleb opened the folder, scanning the pages. It was all there, dates, names, amounts, more than enough to bury Vivian Hale. This is good work, he said. It's dangerous work, Mr. Chen corrected. If she discovers I gave you this, My wife and I will pay for it. Then we make sure she doesn't discover it. And how do you plan to do that? The moment you ride to Carson City, her people will know. She has eyes everywhere. Mara spoke up. What if we don't ride? What if we send someone she wouldn't suspect? Like who? Like Mrs. Chen. The room went silent. Mrs. Chen stared at Mara. Excuse me? Vivian knows Caleb and I can't be trusted. She'll have people watching us. But you? You're respectable. You've never caused trouble. If you took a trip to Carson City, maybe to visit relatives or buy supplies, no one would think twice. You want me to deliver this evidence to the marshal? I want us to have a chance, Mara said, and this is the only way I can see to get it. Mrs. Chen looked at her husband. Some wordless communication passed between them. Finally, Mr. Chen nodded. I'll go, Mrs. Chen said. But if this fails, if Vivian comes after us, then we stand together, Caleb said. All of us. You say that now, but when the bullets start flying, people tend to scatter. Not us. Mrs. Chen studied him, then smiled faintly. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. When should I leave? Tomorrow. The sooner the better. They left the Chen house with the folder hidden under Caleb's coat, moving quickly through the dark streets. They were almost back to the horses when the voice stopped them. Going somewhere? Dutch stepped out of the shadows, and this time he'd brought more than guns. 4 men flanked him, and behind them, dressed in furs and expensive wool, stood Vivian Hale herself. Mrs. Rourke, Vivian said, her voice smooth as silk. Mr. Rourke. Out for an evening stroll? Caleb's hand moved toward his gun, but Dutch was faster, his weapon already drawn, and pointed at Caleb's chest. I wouldn't, Dutch said. Vivian stepped closer, her eyes glittering in the lamplight from a nearby window. You've been busy, visiting the Chens, making plans. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? We're just talking to friends, Mara said. Friends? Vivian laughed. You don't have friends in this town, dear. You have people who are too scared to cross me, and people who work for me. The Chens fall into the first category. For now. What do you want, Vivian? What I've always wanted. Cooperation. You give me what I'm owed, access to that gold claim, and compensation for the trouble you've caused, and I'll forget about the debt, forget about your little conspiracy, and let you live in peace. And if we refuse? Vivian's smile disappeared. Then I stop playing nice. Your father's debt becomes your debt. The cabin you're squatting in? Turns out the land belongs to a prospector's family who've hired me to reclaim it. Your mother's medical bills? Those get called in immediately. And if you still refuse to cooperate, well, accidents happen, especially to people living alone in the mountains. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt the folder pressing against his ribs, the weight of everything they'd risked to get it. You can't just take what's mine, he said. Watch me. I've taken from better people than you, and they all learned the same lesson eventually. In Red Hollow, I make the rules. Not for much longer. The words were out before Caleb could stop them. Vivian's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means your time's running out. Vivian stared at him, then at Mara, her expression calculating. You're bluffing. You've got nothing. Are you sure about that? For the first time, Caleb saw uncertainty flicker across Vivian's face. She looked at Dutch, who shrugged, as confused as she was. Search them, Vivian ordered. Dutch moved forward, but Mara stepped between him and Caleb. You don't have the authority, she said. I have all the authority I need. Not in the street, you don't. Not without witnesses who aren't on your payroll. And that's when doors started opening. Windows lit up. People stepped out onto porches and into the street, drawn by the commotion. The baker, the blacksmith, the widow who ran the boarding house. People who'd been silent for years, who'd let Vivian run roughshod over the town, but who were still watching. Vivian saw them too. Her jaw tightened. This isn't over, she said. I know, Caleb replied. Vivian turned and walked away, Dutch and his men following. But Caleb could see the way her hands were clenched, the stiffness in her spine. They'd rattled her. Maybe not enough to stop her, but enough to buy time. They didn't speak until they were out of town and halfway up the mountain. Then Mara let out a breath that turned to mist in the cold air. That was close. Too close. Do you think Mrs. Chen will still go? If she's smart, she'll leave tonight, before Vivian has time to put more pieces together. And if Vivian figures it out anyway? Caleb didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like a lie. They reached the cabin to find Mara's mother asleep, the fire burning low. Caleb added wood while Mara checked on her, smoothing blankets and whispering reassurances. When she came back, she sat beside him on the floor, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. "I'm scared," she said quietly. "Me too." "You don't seem like the type who gets scared." "Everyone gets scared. It's what you do with it that matters." Mara was quiet for a moment. "What are we going to do if this doesn't work? If the marshal doesn't come, or if he's on Vivian's payroll too?" "Then we fight. Against how many people?" "However many it takes." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You really believe that? That we can win?" "I believe we've got a better chance together than apart. That's enough for now." Mara nodded, but she didn't move away. They sat there in this firelight, the weight of what was coming pressing down on both of them, but somehow lighter for being shared. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Winter was settling in for real now, and with it came the kind of cold that could kill if you weren't careful. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the small fortress they'd built from determination and desperation, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not safety, not comfort, but purpose. The next day brought fresh snow and no word from town. Caleb spent the morning checking traps and reinforcing the barn, while Mara worked on mending clothes and teaching her mother how to braid rope from dried grass, something to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. Around noon, Caleb heard horses. 2 of them, coming fast up the mountain path. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, Mara right behind him. The riders burst into the clearing, not Dutch's men, but 2 women, Mrs. Chen, looking windblown and fierce, and beside her someone Caleb didn't recognize. Younger, maybe 25, dressed in men's clothes with a rifle slung across her back. They dismounted quickly, and Mrs. Chen strode toward the cabin. "We need to talk," she said. Inside, with coffee poured and everyone settled, Mrs. Chen explained. The young woman was her niece, Sarah, who just arrived from Carson City with news. "The territorial marshal's dead," Sarah said bluntly. "Shot 2 weeks ago. They're saying it was a robbery, but everyone knows it was Vivian's people. She's got reach farther than anyone thought." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Caleb set down his coffee cup carefully, keeping his hand steady through sheer willpower. "Then who's in charge now?" Mara asked. "A deputy marshal named Coleman, young, idealistic, and from what I hear, not in anyone's pocket yet." Sarah leaned forward. "But he's also inexperienced. If we're going to convince him to move against Vivian, we need more than just ledgers. We need testimony. People willing to stand up in court and say what she's done." "No one in Red Hollow will do that," Mrs. Chen said. "They're too scared." "Then we get people from outside, people she's hurt in other towns." Sarah pulled out a notebook. "I did some asking around. Vivian's got enemies. Lots of them. Miners she cheated, merchants she drove out of business, families she destroyed. If we can bring them together, show Coleman a pattern." "That'll take time," Caleb said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I can ride to the mining camps, gather statements. You 2 keep your heads down and stay alive." "What about you?" Mara asked Mrs. Chen. "If Vivian suspects you helped us, then she suspects. I'm tired of living in fear." Mrs. Chen's voice was steel. "My husband and I are leaving Red Hollow. We're selling the bank to someone from Carson City and moving east. But before we go, I'm going to make sure that woman gets what she deserves." There was something fierce and final in her words. Caleb looked at these 2 women, one old enough to be his mother, one young enough to be reckless, and felt a shift in the odds. "All right," he said, "we do this smart. Sarah gathers testimony. Mrs. Chen, you and your husband pack up and get out before Vivian makes a move. Mara and I—" "We become bait," Mara finished. "What?" "Think about it. Vivian knows something's happening, but she doesn't know what. If we disappear, she'll tear apart the town looking for us. But if we stay visible, keep living our lives, she'll focus on us instead of everyone else." "That's suicide." "No, it's strategy. We stay close to town, close enough that she can watch us. We don't do anything suspicious, and when Sarah comes back with the testimony, we spring the trap." Sarah grinned. I like how you think. I don't, Caleb said. You're talking about painting targets on our backs. The targets are already there. We're just being honest about it. Caleb wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Mara was right. Running would only delay the inevitable. Standing and fighting, even if it meant taking the biggest risk, was the only way through. 2 weeks, he said finally. That's all the time we can give you. It'll be enough, Sarah promised. You just stay alive till then. She left that afternoon riding hard for the mining camps. Mrs. Chen stayed long enough to share one more piece of information that Vivian had called a town meeting for the following week, ostensibly to discuss security concerns, but really to tighten her grip even further. She'll use it to turn people against you, Mrs. Chen warned. Make you out to be thieves, troublemakers, whatever lies serve her purpose. Then we'll be there, Mara said, and we'll tell the truth. The truth doesn't always win. But lies don't always hold either. Mrs. Chen smiled, sad and proud at the same time. You've got more courage than sense, girl. I hope it's enough. After she left, Mara stood at the window, watching the snow fall. Her mother was asleep again, her breathing easier than it had been in months. Caleb came to stand beside her. You sure about this? He asked. No, but I'm not backing down either. That town meeting, it's going to be ugly. I know. So Vivian's going to say things. About you, about us. Things designed to hurt. Let her. I've heard worse. Mara turned to look at him. I spent my whole life being invisible, Caleb. Being someone people look through instead of at. I'm done with that. If standing up means they finally see me, even if what they see is ugly, then so be it. Caleb reached out, hesitated, then put his hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he touched her beyond necessity, and he felt her tense, then relax. They already see you, he said quietly. They just don't want to admit it. What about you? What about me? Do you see me? He looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first day in the general store. He saw the tiredness around her eyes, the determination in her jaw, the strength that came from surviving things that should have broken her. He saw someone who'd walked 5 miles through snow to make a deal with a stranger, someone who'd bluffed Dutch Kramer without flinching, someone who was terrified but refused to let fear make her small. Yeah, he said. I see you. Something passed between them in that moment, not love, not yet, but recognition. The kind that only came from people who'd been to the edge and chosen to jump anyway. The next week crawled by like a wounded animal. Caleb and Mara made a point of being visible, riding into town every other day for supplies, attending the small church service on Sunday, showing their faces and refusing to hide. People stared. People whispered, but no one confronted them directly. Dutch and his men watched from a distance, waiting for orders. Vivian herself stayed out of sight, but her presence hung over everything like smoke. And then came the night of the town meeting. The whole town packed into the meeting hall, a drafty building that served as courthouse, dance hall, and gathering place depending on the need. Lamps hung from the rafters, casting long shadows. Chairs were arranged in rows, and a podium stood at the front where Vivian waited, dressed in black silk that made her look like a well-fed spider. Caleb and Mara entered together, and the room fell silent, every eye turned to them. Caleb could feel the weight of judgment, the curiosity and contempt mixing into something toxic. They took seats in the back, refusing to be intimidated. Mara's hand found his, squeezing once, and he squeezed back. Vivian called the meeting to order, her voice carrying easily across the crowded room. She talked about prosperity, about security, about the need to protect Red Hollow from outside threats. And then, with the skill of someone who'd done this before, she turned the conversation toward Caleb and Mara. We have new residents among us, she said, her smile sharp. Caleb Rourke and his wife. I'm sure you all remember the circumstances of their marriage. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Caleb felt Mara stiffen beside him. Now, I don't judge anyone for how they find happiness. But when that happiness comes with questions about unexplained wealth, about land ownership, about the safety of our community, then those questions need answers. What questions? Caleb called out. Vivian's smile widened. Where did you get that gold, Mr. Rourke? And more importantly, who does it really belong to? I found it. On my land. That makes it mine. Your land, interesting. Because according to territorial records, that claim was filed by a man named Jameson 30 years ago. He died without heirs, or so we thought. But recently I've been contacted by a lawyer representing Jameson's surviving family. They have a legal claim to that land, which means anything you found on it belongs to them. It was a lie. Caleb knew it, but he couldn't prove it. Not here, not now. That's not how it works, he said. It's exactly how it works. Unless you can produce a legal deed showing you purchased the land fair and square. Vivian paused. Can you do that, Mr. Rourke? The silence was damning. Caleb didn't have a deed. He'd simply claimed the land, built on it, and assumed that was enough. In most places, it would have been. But Vivian had found his weak spot and driven a knife straight into it. I didn't think so, Vivian continued. Which puts us in a difficult position. We have a man living on disputed land, in possession of wealth that may not belong to him, married to a woman under questionable circumstances. What are we as a community supposed to do about that? Before anyone could answer, Mara stood up. You want to know about questionable circumstances, Mrs. Hale? Let's talk about yours. The room went dead quiet. Vivian's smile froze. Excuse me? You heard me. Mara's voice didn't waver. You want to question my marriage? Fine. But first, explain how you've managed to acquire half the property in this town at prices no one else can match. Explain the loans you give with terms that guarantee default. Explain how every person who's ever stood up to you has ended up broke, run out of town, or dead. Those are serious accusations. They're true. And everyone in this room knows it. Vivian's expression darkened. Careful, girl. Slander is a crime. So is extortion. So is fraud. So is murder. Mara took a step forward. You killed the territorial marshal, didn't you? Had him shot because he was getting too close to your operation. The room erupted, people shouting, some in agreement, some in denial. Dutch moved toward Mara, but Caleb was already on his feet, rifle in hand, pointed at Dutch's chest. Sit down, Caleb said quietly. Dutch froze. Vivian raised a hand and slowly, reluctantly, Dutch backed off. This is absurd, Vivian said, her voice cutting through the noise. These are the desperate lies of desperate people. They have no proof, no evidence. We have plenty of evidence, Mara interrupted. Ledgers, letters, testimony from people you've destroyed. And it's all on its way to the new deputy marshal in Carson City right now. It was a gamble. Sarah hadn't returned yet, might not have even gathered all the testimony, but Mara said it with such conviction that even Caleb almost believed her. Vivian's face went pale, then red. You're bluffing. Am I? You want to bet everything on that? For a long moment, nobody moved. The whole room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And then Vivian laughed. Not her usual calculated smile, but a real laugh, harsh and ugly and full of rage. You stupid girl, you have no idea what you've started. She snapped her fingers. Dutch and his men drew their guns. People screamed, diving for cover. Caleb raised his rifle, but there were too many of them, too many angles. This was it. The moment where everything either held together or shattered completely. And then the door burst open, and Sarah rode her horse straight into the meeting hall. The horse's hooves struck the wooden floor like thunder, scattering people in every direction. Sarah didn't slow down, didn't hesitate. She rode straight through the center of the meeting hall, her face wild with triumph and exhaustion, and behind her came 3 more riders, hard-looking men in trail clothes, their faces weathered by wind and sun. Dutch's men swung their guns toward the newcomers, but Sarah was faster. She pulled her rifle and fired once into the ceiling. The shot cracked through the room like a whip, and in the ringing silence that followed, she spoke. Deputy Marshal Coleman sends his regards, she said, her voice carrying to every corner. And he's real interested in what's been happening in Red Hollow. One of the men behind her dismounted, moving with the kind of authority that came from wearing a badge for years. He was older than Caleb expected, maybe 50, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen every kind of ugly the frontier could produce. I'm Coleman, he said, and unless somebody wants to explain why I just rode into a room full of drawn weapons, I suggest everyone puts their guns down. Now. Dutch looked at Vivian. Vivian's face had gone from pale to bloodless, her mouth a thin line. She gave a tiny shake of her head, and Dutch slowly lowered his weapon. His men followed suit, though their hands stayed close to their holsters. Caleb lowered his rifle, but didn't set it down. He could feel Mara beside him, tense as a drawn bowstring, her breathing shallow and quick. Coleman surveyed the room, taking in the frightened faces, the overturned chairs, the way people had pressed themselves against the walls. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on here?" "Nothing that concerns you, Marshal," Vivian said, her composure returning like armor sliding into place. "Just a town meeting. Things got a bit heated, that's all." "Heated enough for guns?" "A misunderstanding." Coleman's eyes moved to Sarah. "That's your assessment, Miss Chen." "No, sir. What you've got here is a woman who's been running this town like her personal fiefdom for the better part of a decade. Extortion, fraud, intimidation, and at least one murder. Maybe more." Vivian's voice went sharp. "Those are lies." "Are they?" Coleman reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick folder, the same one Caleb and Mara had given to Mrs. Chen. "Because I've got 50 pages of documentation here that says different. Bank records, loan agreements, letters threatening people who couldn't pay. All signed by you. Those documents are private business records. They prove nothing illegal. Maybe not on their own, but combined with sworn testimony from 12 people across 3 counties, miners you cheated, merchants you drove out, families you destroyed, they paint a pretty clear picture." Coleman stepped closer to Vivian. "And then there's this matter of Marshall Hendricks, killed 2 weeks ago in what everyone called a robbery. Except he wasn't robbed. His money, his badge, his gun, all still on his body. The only thing missing was a report he'd been writing, a report about you." The room was so quiet Caleb could hear his own heartbeat. Vivian stood frozen, her eyes calculating, searching for an angle, a way out. "You can't prove I had anything to do with that," she said finally. "Not yet, but I've got witnesses who saw your men in Carson City the day before Hendricks died. And I've got a ballistics expert who says the bullet that killed him came from a rifle your foreman carries." Coleman nodded toward Dutch. "That rifle, specifically." Every eye in the room turned to Dutch. His face went gray, and he took a step back, shaking his head. "I didn't kill nobody," he said. "Then whose rifle killed Marshall Hendricks?" "I don't know. Maybe it was stolen." Maybe you're lying." Coleman's voice was flat, final. "Dutch Kramer, you're under arrest for the murder of Marshal James Hendricks. Vivian Hale, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, extortion, and about a dozen other charges I'll have drawn up by morning." Vivian laughed. It came out sharp and bitter, nothing like her usual calculated charm. "You think you can arrest me in my own town?" "It's not your town, ma'am. It belongs to the territory. And the territory's got laws." "Laws?" Vivian spat the word. "Laws written by men who've never set foot out here, who don't understand how things work on the frontier. You need strong people to build civilization, Marshal. People willing to make hard choices." "Hard choices? That what you call murdering a lawman?" "I call it survival. Hendricks was going to destroy everything I built, turn this town into chaos. I did what needed doing." The admission hung in the air like smoke. People stared at Vivian, shock and horror mixing with something that looked almost like relief. The mask had finally dropped. The woman who'd ruled them through fear and manipulation had just confessed to murder in front of 100 witnesses. Coleman nodded to the men who'd ridden in with him. "Take them both." Dutch made a run for it. He bolted toward the door, shoving people out of his way, his hand going for his gun. But one of Coleman's deputies was faster. The deputy's rifle cracked once, and Dutch went down hard, clutching his leg and screaming. Vivian didn't run. She stood there, straight-backed and defiant, even as the deputies moved in with iron shackles. When they locked the cuffs around her wrists, she turned her gaze to Mara. "You think you've won," she said, her voice low and venomous. "You think this changes anything. But you're still nobody. Still the seamstress's daughter. Still the girl everyone ignored. This won't make them respect you. It'll just make them resent you for tearing down the only person who kept this town running." Mara walked forward until she was standing directly in front of Vivian. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she smiled, small and cold and absolutely certain. "I don't need their respect," she said. "I just needed you gone." Vivian's face twisted with rage, but the deputies were already pulling her toward the door. Dutch was dragged out behind her, still cursing and bleeding. The room erupted in noise, people talking, arguing, some crying with relief, others stunned into silence. Coleman waited for the chaos to settle before speaking again. I'm establishing a temporary territorial authority over Red Hollow until we can get proper elections organized. Anyone got a problem with that? Nobody spoke. The fight had gone out of the room along with Vivian. Good. Now everyone go home. We'll have a proper accounting of all this in the morning. Coleman turned to Caleb and Mara. You two, I need statements from both of you, and I'll need to verify that land claim of yours, Rourke. Fair enough, Caleb said. They spent the next 2 hours in what passed for the marshal's office, a cramped room behind the general store that smelled like dust and old leather. Coleman was thorough, asking questions that cut to the bone, making them walk through every detail of the past month. Sarah sat in the corner looking satisfied and exhausted in equal measure. When it was done, Coleman leaned back in his chair and studied them both. You two took one hell of a risk. Didn't feel like we had much choice, Mara said. There's always a choice. Most people choose to keep their heads down and hope the storm passes. You chose to walk into it. He pulled out a tobacco pouch, started rolling a cigarette. That takes guts, or stupidity, sometimes both. Which do you think it was? Honestly, I think you got lucky. If Sarah hadn't shown up when she did, if those witnesses hadn't been willing to talk, if I hadn't been new enough to give a damn, this could have gone very different. But it didn't, Caleb said. No, it didn't. Coleman lit his cigarette, exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Your land claim's legal, by the way. I checked the records. Jameson filed the original claim, but he abandoned it after 2 years. It reverted to territorial jurisdiction, which means you had every right to stake it. Vivian was lying about the family coming forward. Relief washed through Caleb so suddenly he had to sit down. So we're clear? On that, yeah. But you're going to have people in this town who blame you for what happened tonight. Vivian had allies, people who profited from her schemes. They won't just disappear. We can handle it, Mara said. Can you? Because handling it means living with the consequences. Means walking down streets where people whisper. Means doing business with folks who wish you'd kept your mouth shut. Coleman stubbed out his cigarette. I've seen it before. Towns like this, they don't always thank the people who expose corruption. Sometimes they punish them for it. Then I guess we'll find out what this town's made of, Mara said. Coleman smiled faintly. I guess you will. They left the office as dawn was breaking, the sky turning from black to gray to pink. Red Hollow looked different in the early light, smaller somehow, less threatening. Or maybe Caleb just felt bigger, like he'd spent years hunched over and was finally standing straight. Sarah walked them to their horses, her own mount looking as tired as she did. You heading back to the cabin? Eventually, Mara said. First we need to check on my mother, make sure she's all right. She's fine. Mrs. Chen's been staying with her since you came down for the meeting. Sarah grinned. Figured you'd need someone watching your backs. Thank her for us. Thank her yourself. She and her husband are throwing a party tomorrow night. Celebration of new beginnings, she called it. You're invited. Caleb and Mara exchanged glances. A party. The idea felt foreign, almost absurd after everything they'd been through. But there was something appealing about it too, the chance to be normal, even for one night. We'll be there, Mara said. They rode up the mountain as the sun climbed higher, warming the frozen ground and making the snow glitter like scattered diamonds. The cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney, and Caleb felt something in his chest unclench. Home. It was actually home now, not just a place he was hiding. Mrs. Chen was waiting on the porch, wrapped in blankets, Mara's mother beside her looking healthier than Caleb had ever seen her. Both women stood when the riders approached, and Mrs. Chen's face broke into a smile. You did it, she said. We did it, Mara corrected, dismounting and pulling the older woman into a hug. None of this happens without you. Nonsense, I just provided paperwork. You two did the hard part. Mara's mother reached out, touching her daughter's face with trembling fingers. I was so worried. I know, Mama, but it's over now. Vivian's in custody, and we're safe. Are we? Really? It was Caleb who answered. As safe as anyone can be out here. But, yeah, the worst is behind us. They went inside, and for the first time in weeks, the cabin felt like more than just shelter. It felt like sanctuary. Mrs. Chen had cooked, somehow finding ingredients Caleb didn't even know he had, and they ate together, the four of them crowded around the small table, sharing stories and laughter that came easier than any of them expected. Later, after Mrs. Chen had left and Mara's mother had fallen asleep, Caleb and Mara sat by the fire. The silence between them was comfortable now, worn smooth by weeks of shared danger and survival. "What happens next?" Mara asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we made this deal because we both needed something. You needed help, I needed protection. But Vivian's gone now. The threat's over." She looked at him, her expression carefully neutral. "So what happens to us?" Caleb had been wondering the same thing. The marriage had started as a transaction, a practical solution to impossible problems, but somewhere along the way it had become something else. He wasn't sure what to call it. Partnership felt too cold. Friendship felt incomplete. Whatever it was, it mattered. "I don't know," he said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" "I want," Mara paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to. I want to build something here. Make this place into more than just survival." "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet. But I know I don't want to go back to being invisible. And I know I don't want to do it alone." She met his eyes. "We make a good team, Caleb. Better than I expected." "Yeah, we do. So maybe we keep going, see where this leads." It wasn't a declaration of love. Wasn't poetry or romance or any of the things people usually said when they talked about marriage. But it was honest, and it was real, and that meant more than any pretty words ever could. "All right," Caleb said. "We keep going." Mara smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it reached all the way to her eyes. The next night, they rode back to town for Mrs. Chen's party. Caleb had expected something small, subdued, but what they found was half of Red Hollow crammed into the Chen house and spilling out into the yard. Lanterns hung from trees, someone had brought a fiddle, and people were actually smiling. Mrs. Chen greeted them at the door, already a bit tipsy on wine. "You came!" "We said we would," Mara replied. "I know, but I wasn't sure. After everything." She waved a hand vaguely. Come in, come in. There's food, drink, and at least 6 people who want to apologize to you." "Apologize for what?" "For being cowards while Vivian ran roughshod over everyone." Mrs. Chen's smile turned sad. "People feel guilty. They want to make it right." The party was awkward at first. People approached Caleb and Mara in fits and starts, offering stilted thanks and half-formed apologies. The baker who'd watched Mara get humiliated in the general store. The blacksmith who'd looked the other way when Dutch threatened people. The widow who'd never said a word when Vivian foreclosed on her neighbor's property. Some of the apologies felt genuine. Others felt like self-preservation, people trying to get on the right side of the new power structure. Caleb accepted them all with the same careful neutrality, not sure yet who could be trusted. But Mara was different. She moved through the crowd with something that looked almost like grace, accepting apologies, making conversation, slowly building bridges to people who'd ignored her for years. Caleb watched her work and felt something close to pride. Around midnight, the party started winding down. People drifted home, leaving only the core group, the Chens, Sarah, a few others who'd actively helped bring down Vivian. They sat in the parlor, passing around a bottle of whiskey that was probably older than the town itself. "What's going to happen to Red Hollow now?" the blacksmith asked. "With Vivian gone, who's going to run things?" "We run things," Mrs. Chen said. "Ourselves. The way it should have been from the start." "Easier said than done. We still need credit, still need someone to organize trade routes, handle disputes. Then we elect people to do those jobs. Have actual elections, not just Vivian deciding everything behind closed doors." Sarah leaned forward. "Coleman's staying on as marshal until the territory appoints someone permanent. He can keep order while we figure out the rest. And the businesses Vivian owned, the buildings, the land, territory will auction them off. Use the money to pay back some of what she stole." Mrs. Chen took a sip of whiskey. "Won't make everyone whole, but it's better than nothing." They talked through plans, possibilities, the slow work of rebuilding something that had been rotted from the inside. Caleb listened without contributing much, content to let others shape the future of a town he'd never really been part of. But then the banker, Mr. Chen, turned to him. "What about you, Rourke? You planning to stay around?" "That's the plan." "Then you should have a say in how things go. You and Mara both. You earned it." "I'm not a town person," Caleb said. "Maybe not, but you're part of this community now, whether you like it or not. And we need people like you. People willing to stand up when things go bad." Mr. Chen raised his glass. "To new beginnings, and to the people brave enough to fight for them." They all drank to that, and for a moment Caleb let himself believe it might actually work, that Red Hollow might become something other than a place where the strong preyed on the weak, that he and Mara might actually have a future here. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But when they reached the clearing and dismounted, Mara grabbed Caleb's arm. "Wait!" He turned. She was looking at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the mountains beyond bathed in moonlight. "What is it?" "Nothing. I wanted to remember this. How it feels right now." She looked at him. "We won, Caleb. Against all odds, against people with more power and money and guns. We actually won. We got lucky. Maybe, but we also fought. We didn't give up." Her grip on his arm tightened. "Thank you for giving me a chance when nobody else would. You gave me one first, that day in the general store. I fixed your boot. You saw me." Caleb covered her hand with his own. "That mattered more than you know." They stood there in the cold, two people who'd started as strangers and become something neither of them had words for yet. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, probably difficult, but theirs to shape. Inside, Mara's mother was awake, sitting by the fire and working on a piece of embroidery. She looked up when they entered, her eyes knowing. "Everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Mama," Mara said. "Better than fine." "Good, because I've been thinking, this cabin's getting crowded. You two should build an addition. Give yourselves some proper privacy." Caleb and Mara exchanged glances, both of them trying not to laugh at the old woman's bluntness. "We'll think about it," Mara said. "Don't think too long. I'm not getting any younger, and I'd like to see grandchildren before I die." "Mama!" "What? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." That night, after her mother had gone to sleep, Caleb and Mara sat by the fire as they had so many nights before. But this time, Mara moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, letting himself accept the comfort and connection. "She's not wrong, you know," Mara said quietly. "About building an addition. This place is small. We could manage." "We could. But we don't have to just manage anymore. We can actually build something, make plans for more than just surviving the next day." Caleb thought about that. Plans, future, things he'd given up on years ago when he'd climbed into these mountains to die slowly and alone. But Mara had changed that, whether either of them had intended it or not. "What kind of addition?" he asked. "A real bedroom for one, maybe a proper kitchen, and if we're dreaming big, a workshop where I could do real sewing, take on clients again, but on my terms." "That sounds good. Yeah?" "Yeah." He paused. "And maybe, eventually, your mother's right. About the other thing." Mara lifted her head to look at him. "You want children?" "I don't know. Maybe. Someday." He met her eyes. "What about you?" I think I might, but not yet. Not until we're sure this is what we both want. Not until it's real." "How do we know when it's real?" Mara smiled. "I guess we'll know when we know." It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. They sat there until the fire burned down to embers, neither wanting to break the moment. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside the cabin they'd defended and claimed and made theirs, everything was warm. The next few weeks brought changes that came faster than anyone expected. Coleman stayed true to his word, organizing elections for town council and making sure everyone, even the miners and the Chinese merchants who'd been shut out before, had a voice. The businesses Vivian had owned were auctioned off, and the money went into a community fund to rebuild what she'd destroyed. Dutch Kramer survived his gunshot wound but was shipped off to territorial prison to await trial for murder. Vivian fought her charges with lawyers paid for by mysterious benefactors, but the evidence was overwhelming. The trial lasted 3 days and the verdict was guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and the entire town turned out to watch her loaded onto the prison wagon. She didn't look at anyone as they drove her away. Just stared straight ahead, her face carved from stone, already planning her next move. Caleb knew women like Vivian didn't just accept defeat, but for now at least she was someone else's problem. Red Hollow started to breathe again. New businesses opened. The mining claims that Vivian had seized through fraud were returned to their rightful owners. The Chinese merchants who'd been forced to pay protection money stopped paying, and when nothing bad happened, others followed suit. It wasn't perfect. There were still disputes, still people who resented the changes, still those who whispered that Vivian had at least kept things orderly. But it was better, and better was enough. Caleb and Mara settled into their new life with the kind of careful hope that came from people who'd learned not to take anything for granted. They started building the addition, Caleb doing the heavy work, Mara planning the layout, both of them learning how to work together without stepping on each other's toes. Mara took on sewing clients again, but this time she charged fair prices and didn't accept work from people who'd treated her like dirt. Word spread that she was good, better than good, and soon she had more work than she could handle. Caleb found that people sought him out for advice on hunting, trapping, surviving in the mountains. He started taking on students, young men from town who wanted to learn the skills their fathers had never taught them. It gave him purpose beyond just survival, and he discovered he liked teaching more than he'd expected. And slowly, almost without noticing, the distance between him and Mara began to close. Small touches became common. Conversations became deeper. The way they looked at each other changed from partnership to something warmer, something that made Caleb's chest tight and his future feel possible. One night, about 2 months after Vivian's arrest, they were working on the addition when Mara's hammer slipped and she smashed her thumb. She yelped, dropping the hammer and shaking her hand. Caleb was beside her in an instant. "Let me see. It's fine. Let me see." She held out her hand and he examined the thumb, already swelling, probably going to bruise, but nothing broken. He should have let go then, but he didn't. Just stood there holding her hand, feeling her pulse against his fingers. "Caleb?" He kissed her. It wasn't planned, wasn't calculated, just something that felt right in that moment. She stiffened in surprise, then melted into it, her good hand coming up to cup the back of his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "That was..." Mara started. "Yeah. Should we talk about this?" "Probably." But neither of them moved. They just stood there in the half-built addition, surrounded by sawdust and tools, and let the moment be what it was. "I'm scared," Mara admitted finally. "Of what?" "Of this becoming real, of it mattering too much." She looked up at him. "What if we mess it up? What if we lose this?" "Then we lose it. But at least we'll have tried." That's not very reassuring. "I know, but it's the truth." Caleb tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm scared too, Mara. Terrified, actually. But I'm more scared of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been." She kissed him this time, slower, deeper, full of all the things neither of them knew how to say. When they broke apart again, she smiled. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" "Looks like it." "What about your deal? The one where we're just partners, no ownership, walk away if it doesn't work?" "What about it?" "I don't want to walk away anymore." "Neither do I." They finished the addition 2 weeks later, and that night they moved into their new bedroom, a real room with walls and a door and space that was theirs alone. Mara's mother took over the main room without complaint, clearly delighted to have her privacy back. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing green back to the mountains. The cabin that had felt like a fortress during winter became something else. A home, complete with curtains Mara had sewn, furniture Caleb had built, and a garden they planted together in the yard. Red Hollow continued its slow transformation. Coleman became the permanent marshal, bringing his wife and 2 kids from Carson City. Mrs. Chen's husband sold the bank to a cooperative owned by the townspeople themselves. The old power structures crumbled, and new ones, more fair, more democratic, rose to take their place. And through it all, Caleb and Mara built their life one day at a time, learning how to be married not out of necessity, but out of choice. It wasn't always easy. They fought sometimes, disagreed about money and priorities, and 100 small things that seemed huge in the moment. But they also laughed, worked side by side, and discovered that the deal they'd struck in desperation had become something neither of them wanted to live without. On the first anniversary of their marriage, Caleb came home from checking traps to find Mara standing in the yard, her hands on her hips, looking at something he couldn't see. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just thinking." "About what?" She turned to him, and there was something in her eyes, nervous but happy, scared but certain. "About what your mother-in-law said. About grandchildren." It took Caleb a moment to process what she was saying. When he did, his heart stuttered in his chest. "You mean, I think I'm ready, if you are." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "Yeah, I'm ready." And as the sun set over the mountains they'd claimed and defended and made theirs, as the town below continued its slow healing, Caleb Rourke held his wife close and let himself believe in the future. Not because it was guaranteed, not because everything would be perfect, but because they'd fought for it, bled for it, and refused to let anyone, not Vivian Hale, not the town, not their own fear, take it away from them. They'd won. Not just the battle, but the war. And now, finally, they could start living instead of just surviving. The seasons turned, and with them came changes that neither Caleb nor Mara could have predicted when they'd first shaken hands in that cold cabin over a desperate bargain. Spring gave way to summer, summer to fall, and by the time winter came around again, the landscape of their lives had shifted in ways both visible and invisible. Mara's pregnancy showed by late autumn, a small swell beneath her work dresses that made her mother cry happy tears, and made Caleb terrified in ways he'd never been terrified before. He could face down armed men, could survive winters that killed weaker people, but the idea of bringing a child into this world, of being responsible for something that fragile, kept him awake at night. "You're doing it again," Mara said one evening, catching him staring at her from across the room. "Doing what?" "Worrying. I can see it in your face." "I'm not worried." "Liar." She set down the shirt she was mending and moved to sit beside him. "Talk to me." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "What if I'm no good at this? Being a father. What if you're great at it?" "I don't know how to be great at it. I barely know how to be a person most days." Mara took his hand, pressing it against her belly where the baby was growing. "You know how to survive, how to protect what matters, how to fight when you have to and yield when you should. That's more than most fathers know." "That's not enough." "It's a start." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We'll figure out the rest together, same way we figured out everything else." But figuring things out got complicated fast. 2 weeks before Mara was due, word came from the territorial prison that Vivian Hale had escaped. Coleman rode up to the cabin himself to deliver the news, his face grim. "Happened 3 nights ago. Guard found her cell empty, lock-picked, no sign of how she got past the walls. They've got search parties out, but so far nothing." Caleb felt ice settle in his gut. "You think she's coming here?" "I think a woman that vindictive doesn't forget who put her away. And I think you should take precautions until we find her." "What kind of precautions?" "Stay alert. Keep your weapons close. Maybe send your wife and her mother down to town until this is settled." "I'm not going anywhere," Mara said from the doorway. She'd been listening, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "This is our home. We don't run." "Mara," Caleb started. "No. We beat her once. We can beat her again." Her voice was firm, but Caleb could see the fear beneath it. "Besides, I'm too pregnant to ride comfortably, and my mother's too fragile to move in this cold. We stay." Coleman looked between them, then sighed. "All right, but I'm posting a deputy nearby. Young kid named Miller, good with a rifle. He'll camp down by the creek, keep watch." "We appreciate it," Caleb said. After Coleman left, the cabin felt smaller, the walls thinner. Caleb checked every window, every door, tested the locks, and loaded extra rifles. Mara tried to maintain normalcy, cooking, sewing, caring for her mother, but the tension was there in every movement. 3 days passed with no sign of Vivian, then 5, then a week. The deputy, Miller, checked in daily but reported nothing unusual. Slowly, carefully, they started to relax. That was when Vivian struck. It happened in the middle of the night. Caleb woke to the smell of smoke and sat up fast, his hand already reaching for the rifle beside the bed. Beside him, Mara was stirring, confused and half asleep. "What?" "Fire," Caleb said. "Get your mother. Get out, now." He ran to the main room and saw flames licking up the outside wall where the addition joined the original cabin. Someone had piled kindling against the wood and set it ablaze, and in the dry winter air it was spreading fast. Mara appeared with her mother, both women wrapped in blankets. Caleb grabbed their arms and shoved them toward the door. "Go to the barn. Stay there." "What about you?" "I'll handle this. Go." They ran, and Caleb turned to fight the fire with buckets of water from the barrel inside. But he knew it was hopeless. The flames were too big, spreading too fast. He managed to save some supplies, dragging them outside, but the cabin itself was lost. He was throwing the last bucket of water when he heard the gunshot. It came from the direction of the barn, sharp and clear in the cold air. Caleb dropped the bucket and ran, his rifle in hand, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The barn door was open. Inside, lit by a single lantern, Vivian Hale stood with a pistol pointed at Mara. She looked different from the last time Caleb had seen her. Thinner, harder, with eyes that had gone dead and cold. Prison had stripped away whatever polish she'd once had, leaving only the raw hunger for revenge. "Hello, Mr. Rourke," she said without looking at him. "Nice of you to join us." Caleb raised his rifle, but Vivian shook her head. "Drop it, or I put a bullet in your wife's belly." Mara stood frozen, her hands protective over her stomach, her face pale. Behind her, her mother sat in the corner, eyes wide with terror. Caleb lowered the rifle slowly, setting it on the ground. "This is between you and me, Vivian. Let them go." "Between us?" Vivian laughed, sharp and bitter. "You destroyed my life, took everything I built, so now I'm going to take everything you have, starting with her. Killing her won't bring back what you lost." "No, but it'll make me feel better." She cocked the pistol. "Any last words?" "Wait." Mara's voice was steady despite the gun pointed at her. "You want revenge? Then kill me. But let my mother go. She never did anything to you." "Your mother's a witness." "She's old and sick. She won't last the winter anyway." Mara's voice didn't waver. "But if you let her live, you can watch me die knowing you showed mercy once, that you weren't completely the monster everyone says you are." Vivian stared at her, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Here was another woman who'd learned to survive by being smarter than the people trying to break her. "You've got guts," Vivian said finally. "I'll give you that." "So do you let her go?" "No." Vivian's finger tightened on the trigger. "Because I am the monster, and monsters don't show mercy." The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. But it wasn't Vivian's gun that fired. Deputy Miller burst through the barn door, his rifle smoking, and Vivian stumbled backward, blood spreading across her shoulder. She fired wildly, her shot going wide, and then Miller fired again. This time, Vivian went down hard. Caleb was moving before she hit the ground, grabbing Mara and pulling her away, checking for injuries, his hands shaking. "Are you hurt? Did she hit you?" "I'm fine. We're fine." Mara's voice was tight, controlled, but her whole body was trembling. Miller moved to Vivian, kicking her pistol away and checking for a pulse. He looked up, his young face grim. "She's alive. Barely." Coleman arrived minutes later with more deputies, drawn by the gunfire and the burning cabin. They loaded Vivian onto a stretcher, still breathing, still dangerous, but finally truly beaten. This time there would be no escape. This time they'd make sure. As they carried her away, Vivian's eyes found Caleb's. "This isn't over," she whispered. But it was. They both knew it. The cabin burned through the night despite everyone's efforts to save it. By morning, only the stone chimney and parts of the foundation remained, everything else reduced to ash and charred timber. Caleb stood in the ruins, looking at what had been their home, and felt something break inside him. "We can rebuild," Mara said beside him. She'd been crying, he could tell, but her voice was steady. "With what? Everything we had was in there." "Not everything. We're still here, all of us." She took his hand. "That's what matters." Caleb wanted to believe her, but looking at the destruction, at his pregnant wife shivering in borrowed blankets, at his mother-in-law who'd already lost so much. He felt like he'd failed them all. The town responded faster than he expected. By afternoon, wagons started arriving. The Chens brought lumber. The blacksmith brought tools. Sarah showed up with her own hands ready to work. Even people who'd been neutral or hostile before came offering help, supplies, labor. Heard what Vivian did, the baker said, unloading flour and salt. Figured the least we could do was help you rebuild. You don't owe us anything, Caleb said. Maybe not, but you stood up when the rest of us were too scared. Seems only right we return the favor. They set up a tent for temporary shelter and started clearing the debris. It was hard work, made harder by the cold and by the fear that still lingered. But slowly, piece by piece, the new cabin began to take shape. It wasn't the same as the old one. This one was bigger, sturdier, built with the knowledge of what they'd almost lost. Mara helped design it despite her pregnancy, insisting on windows that let in more light and a separate room for the baby that was coming. You should rest, Caleb told her one afternoon, watching her lift boards that were probably too heavy. I've been resting. I'm tired of resting. The baby's fine. The doctor checked yesterday, remember? Everything's progressing normally. She set down the board and wiped sweat from her forehead. I need to do this, Caleb. Need to be part of building our new home. Otherwise it feels like Vivian won. She didn't win. She's in prison, probably dying from those gunshot wounds. I know, but she still took something from us. Burned down what we built. I need to prove we can build it back better. So Caleb let her work, staying close and making sure she didn't overdo it. And 3 weeks later, when her water broke in the middle of hammering floorboards, he carried her to the tent and sent someone running for the midwife. The labor lasted 14 hours. Long enough for Caleb to wear a path in the frozen ground outside. Long enough for every fear he'd been suppressing to rise up and choke him. Mara's mother sat with her daughter, offering comfort and wisdom, while Caleb waited and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The baby's first cry cut through the night like a bell, and Caleb's knees went weak with relief. The midwife appeared at the tent flap, smiling. You've got a daughter, healthy, loud, and already mad at the world. Caleb stumbled inside. Mara lay propped against blankets, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked up when he entered, and the smile on her face made everything, the fire, the fear, the fight, worth it. Come meet your daughter, she said. He crossed to them on legs that didn't quite work right and looked down at the baby. She was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be brown like Mara's. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. What should we name her? Mara asked. Caleb had been thinking about this for weeks, running through possibilities. But looking at her now, only one name felt right. Hope, he said. We should call her Hope. Mara's eyes filled with tears. That's perfect. They moved into the new cabin 2 weeks later. The structure finished enough to be livable, even if some details remained incomplete. It felt different from the old cabin. Bigger, brighter, more permanent. This wasn't just shelter anymore. It was a home built by community, strengthened by shared purpose. Hope was a colicky baby, crying through the nights and sleeping restlessly during the day. Caleb walked miles with her, bouncing and shushing, learning the rhythm of fatherhood through sheer exhausted repetition. Mara fed her and changed her, and somehow managed to keep the household running despite getting maybe 3 hours of sleep a night. Mara's mother, who'd seemed frail for so long, found new strength in having a grandchild. She held Hope for hours, singing old songs in a language Caleb didn't recognize, telling stories that made the baby's eyes go wide and curious. She's good with her, Caleb observed one evening, watching his mother-in-law rock Hope by the fire. She always wanted more children, Mara said. But after me, there were complications. The doctor said she'd never carry again. She smiled softly. I think Hope's giving her a second chance at something she thought she'd lost. Spring came again, turning the world green and washing away the last traces of ash from the fire. The new cabin settled into itself, the wood aging and the spaces becoming familiar. And slowly, carefully, life found a rhythm. Caleb took on more students, teaching hunting and survival skills to young men from town. The money helped, but more than that, it gave him purpose beyond just providing for his family. He was passing on knowledge, building connections, becoming part of something larger than himself. Mara's sewing business grew until she had to hire help, two young women from town who wanted to learn the trade. She taught them with the same patience her mother had once shown her, creating not just customers, but community. Red Hollow itself transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The cooperative bank thrived, offering fair loans that helped new businesses start. The town council, now elected by actual votes, made decisions that benefited everyone instead of just the wealthy. Coleman's steady hand as marshal kept order without the corruption that had defined Vivian's reign. People still talked about Vivian sometimes, about the trial where she'd been sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder on top of her original charges, about how she'd aged 20 years in the 6 months since her recapture. Some pitied her. Most just felt relieved she was gone. But Caleb noticed something else happening. The story of what he and Mara had done, standing up to corruption, refusing to back down, building something good from something desperate, had spread beyond Red Hollow. Other towns started asking how they'd done it, how they'd organized, how they'd found the courage. And Mara, who'd once been invisible, became someone people sought out for advice. She spoke at town meetings in neighboring communities, helping them understand how to build systems that served everyone instead of just the powerful. She was good at it, Caleb realized, better than she probably knew. One evening, about a year after Hope's birth, Sarah rode up to the cabin with news. She'd been appointed as a territorial investigator, tasked with rooting out corruption in frontier towns. The job would take her all over, and she wanted Mara's help. Not full-time, Sarah said quickly, seeing the hesitation on Mara's face. Just consultations, letters, maybe the occasional trip when you can manage it, but your insight, what you learned fighting Vivian, it could help a lot of people. Mara looked at Caleb. He saw the question in her eyes, the fear of taking on too much, of neglecting her family. You should do it, he said. Are you sure? I'm sure. You're good at this. And Hope needs to see her mother being more than just what other people expect. So Mara said yes, and over the following months, she became a voice for reform across the territory. She wrote articles for newspapers, corresponded with reformers in other states, slowly building a network of people committed to changing how frontier justice worked. It wasn't always easy. There were still people who resented her, who thought a woman, especially one who'd started as a seamstress, had no business involving herself in politics. But Mara had learned to stand in the light without apologizing for taking up space, and gradually, grudgingly, even her critics had to acknowledge she knew what she was talking about. Hope grew from a colicky infant into a curious toddler who got into everything and feared nothing. She had Mara's determination and Caleb's quiet intensity, along with a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Watching her explore the world with fearless wonder, Caleb understood something he'd never quite grasped before. This was what they'd been fighting for. Not just survival, not just safety, but the chance to build a world where his daughter could grow up free from the kind of fear and powerlessness that had defined both his and Mara's early lives. 2 years after the fire, on the anniversary of their first meeting in the general store, Caleb and Mara stood on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set over the mountains. Hope was asleep inside, watched over by her grandmother. The evening was warm, the first real warmth of spring. You ever think about how we got here? Mara asked. Sometimes. I used to think survival was enough, just making it through each day without things getting worse. She leaned against the railing. But that's not living, is it? That's just existing. No, living's what we do now. We built something good here. Against all odds, despite everything, we actually built something good. Caleb put his arm around her, pulling her close. We did, but it cost. Everything worth having costs. Mara looked up at him. Was it worth it? Everything we went through? He thought about the question seriously, the humiliation in the general store, the desperate bargain, the threats, the fire, the fear. All of it leading to this moment, standing on a porch he'd built with his own hands, with a wife he loved and a daughter sleeping safe inside. Yeah, he said finally. It was worth it. They stood there as darkness fell, two people who'd started as outcasts and become something neither of them had imagined possible. Not heroes, they were too flawed, too scarred for that, but survivors who'd chosen to do more than just survive, who'd fought for something better and won, not because they were strong, but because they refused to give up. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and victories. Mara's mother lived to see Hope turn 5 before passing peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family who loved her. Her funeral brought out the entire town, a testament to how much she'd been valued in her final years. Hope started school in Red Hollow's new schoolhouse, built with community funds and staffed by a teacher from back east who believed girls should learn the same things as boys. She was bright and fierce, often coming home with scraped knees and stories about standing up to bullies twice her size. "She gets that from you," Caleb told Mara one evening, after Hope had recounted defending a smaller boy from harassment. "She gets it from both of us," Mara corrected. "You taught her how to stand her ground. I taught her why it matters." Red Hollow grew and prospered in ways that would have been impossible under Vivian's rule. New families arrived, attracted by fair land prices and honest governance. The mining claims produced steady wealth that benefited the whole community instead of just a few. The town built a proper hospital, a library, even a small theater where traveling shows performed. Coleman eventually retired as marshal, handing the badge to a young deputy who'd learned from his example. Sarah married a lawyer from Carson City and continued her reform work, now with the full backing of the territorial government. The Chens sold their house and moved to San Francisco, but they wrote often, their letters full of pride in what Red Hollow had become. And Caleb and Mara grew old together, not in the way of fairy tales, smooth and perfect, but in the messy, complicated way of real people who'd chosen each other and kept choosing, day after day, year after year. They had 2 more children after Hope, a son they named after Caleb's father, and another daughter who looked so much like Mara's mother, it made them both cry. The cabin expanded again to accommodate the growing family, becoming almost a small compound of connected buildings. Caleb taught all his children how to survive in the mountains, how to read tracks and weather and the subtle signs that meant danger. But he also taught them something more important, that survival alone wasn't enough, that you had to fight for something beyond just making it through another day. Mara taught them to sew, to read, to think critically about the world around them. But more than that, she taught them by example that being overlooked didn't mean being powerless, that sometimes the quietest person in the room was the most dangerous to corrupt systems, that standing up mattered, even when, especially when, it felt impossible. 20 years after that first meeting in the general store, on a warm summer evening, Caleb and Mara sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Hope had married a school teacher from the next town over and had 2 children of her own. Their son was studying law in San Francisco. Their youngest daughter ran Mara's sewing business, which had grown into a full workshop employing a dozen people. "We did all right, didn't we?" Mara said, her hand finding Caleb's the way it had thousands of times before. "Better than all right. You ever regret it? The deal we made?" Caleb thought about the question, about the man he'd been when he first rode down from that mountain, hollow, broken, waiting to die. And he thought about the man he was now, surrounded by family, respected by his community, still flawed and scarred but whole in ways that mattered. "Not for a second," he said. "Not even the hard parts?" "Especially the hard parts. They're what made it real." Mara smiled, and in that smile, Caleb saw the girl who'd knelt in the dirt to fix a stranger's boot, the woman who'd climbed a mountain to make a desperate bargain, the partner who'd stood beside him through fires and threats and the slow, difficult work of building a life. "I love you," she said. Simple words, but they carried 20 years of meaning. "I love you too." They sat there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, while their grandchildren's laughter echoed across the mountain. And Caleb understood something he wished he could go back and tell his younger self, that broken man who'd thought he was done with living. The best things in life, the things worth fighting for, weren't the ones that came easy. They were the ones you built from nothing, protected fiercely, and chose every single day even when choosing was hard. They were the connections forged in desperation and strengthened by time. They were the legacies you left not in gold or land, but in the lives you touched and the world you changed. Because in the end, it wasn't the gold that had saved Caleb Rourke. It wasn't even the land or the cabin or the safety from Vivian's threats. It was the moment a quiet seamstress had seen him when everyone else looked away. The moment 2 invisible people had recognized each other and decided that invisible didn't have to mean powerless. The moment they'd chosen to fight instead of flee, to build instead of hide, to stand in the light no matter how much it scared them. That was what had saved them both, and that was what they'd passed on to their children, their town, everyone whose life they'd touched. The story didn't end with revenge or riches or perfect happiness. It ended with something better. Two people who'd survived the worst and chosen to make something beautiful from the wreckage. Who'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Who'd discovered that love wasn't just passion or romance, but the daily choice to see someone and be seen, to stand together when everything tried to pull you apart. As the stars came out and the mountain air cooled, Caleb and Mara went inside to the home they'd built together. Behind them, the town of Red Hollow settled into evening, forever changed by two outcasts who'd refused to stay invisible. And on the mountain where a broken man had once hidden from the world, life continued, messy, complicated, difficult, and absolutely worth fighting for.